Hello everyone, Jared Ainsworth here. I wanted to make this follow-up video about my IPA still and show everyone where the project stands now. It's come a long way since my first still video, and hopefully I can save some others from making the same mistakes that I did. First, a quick review for anyone who didn't watch my first video. I use this still to reclaim isopropyl alcohol that's been used to clean 3D printed parts coming from my Forum resin printer. The still itself is a cheap single stage still from Amazon. You don't need the version that has the thumper tank. They go for around $80 to $100 these days still. I start out with some very dark or cloudy IPA. You can see this is pretty dark. It's got a lot of white chunky stuff in the bottom. This one that's inside my curing bucket is pretty dark. A lot of times they're almost black depending on which resin I've been using. The jug of dirty IPA first goes into this bucket, my curing bucket, which is lined with reflective tape and UV LEDs. After the UV curing bucket, I run the dirty IPA through one of these funnels with some paper towels. I use these filter funnels that have a Snap-In Sieve in order to remove as much of the chunky stuff as possible. The Snap-In Sieve keeps the paper towels from sticking to the sides of the funnel. That way the IPA can flow through the paper towel all around the cone and not just down at the bottom. From there, the dirty IPA goes right into the still, and what I get out is super clean and clear IPA out the other end. So this is, very clear, smells fine. You can tell there's no chemicals or anything left inside. I have skipped the filtering step a couple of times and just put the dirty stuff right in the pot, but you'll end up with more sludge at the bottom of the pot, so you'll have to deal with cleaning out that later. As long as you're doing the filtering step, you should only have to clean the sludge out of the bottom of the pot maybe every 10 to 15 gallons or so. I'll show some B-roll here about what the sludge that comes out looks like. It's a really thick tar-like nasty stuff. Make sure you dispose of it properly. Here in Austin, they take it for free as long as you make an appointment, but do whatever your city requires. What I get from the output, like I said, is nice and clean and clear IPA. So yeah, that's the process. Now let's talk about the upgrades I've made since the first video. As you can see, I moved everything onto a nice little cart, so it's easy to move around. I added this little heater jacket to the hot pot, but this really wasn't needed. I just had one laying around, so I figured why not use it. It does seem to stabilize the temperature inside the hot pot, but it runs perfectly fine with just the hot plate or just the heater jacket. You can actually do either one. I still run both because I have them, so why not? In the first video I talked about adding a reservoir so I wouldn't have to do ice as often, and I've done that now. There's a 5-gallon bucket down here at the bottom with a fish tank pump inside and a power switch on the side so I can turn it on and off as I need to. I did find that I was still having to add ice way more often than I had wanted to, so the next upgrade I added was one of these cheap little fish tank chillers. You can see it sticking out the side of the cart over here right now. So now I just turn on the chiller for about an hour to cool down the water in my reservoir, and once the whole thing is nice and cold, I go ahead and start the still. The chiller is not capable of keeping up with the heat load from the still. It's good enough to get out about 1 gallon of clean IPA into my catch jug over here before I have to let it cool off again, and then I can restart it. At least this way I don't have to constantly add ice to the reservoir. I do wish the chiller fit into the cart a little better, but I'll probably rebuild it at some point into a smaller enclosure one of these days so it'll fit into the cart. If you do opt for the fish tank chiller, make sure you get one that has a compressor. The air to water ones, they're not gonna get the cold loop down cool enough to get a nice efficient distill. Because the cooling system is now completely closed and I'm not constantly having to drain out water to add more ice, I also added water wetter to the water in the cold loop. The water wetter keeps anything from growing inside the cold loop, and it also keeps the fish tank pump lubricated. After adding the chiller, I found I was getting a lot of condensation on the supply and return lines that go from the reservoir to the condenser. So much so that it was starting to drip and pool up in the bottom of the cart. Wet cart plus high current heaters equals bad. So adding the insulation to all of the water lines and then putting a neoprene jacket on the reservoir down here, that solved the condensation problem. I still get condensation on the condenser up here on the outside of the pot, but it doesn't pool up anywhere dangerous. It just drips onto the hot pot and it's not a big deal, so I don't worry about it. With my original setup, the output was going into just one of these plastic collection jugs, but I found that as the hot plate cycled, the jug would pressurize and then it would get crushed and it would collapse when the heat shut off. The first thing I did to solve that was I drilled a hole into my collection cap, but I found a 0.4 millimeter hole was too small and I was still getting the pressurization and the collapsing. I found a 0.6 millimeter hole, that worked great. I was able to stop the collapsing from happening. The next problem I ran into though when I had the vent was the IPA would start to flow along the bottom of the collection cap and a little bit of it would come out of that vent and I would lose a little bit of IPA. So the next thing I did was add a downspout to this collection cap. It might be hard to see in the video, but there's a little tube that comes down here. So now the IPA comes down, it drips off the bottom of the downspout and I stopped losing any of it out of the vent hole. The next fun issue I ran into was I let it run too long and it turned the vent hole into a really powerful IPA geyser. You can imagine my horror when I came out and saw IPA spraying 15 feet into the air and just covering everything, the whole area, with highly flammable liquid. Yikes, that was pretty scary. First thing I did was yank the extension cord out and grab the fire extinguisher. Luckily for me, nothing bad happened. But after that little scare, I did add a second collection tank and I moved the vent cap over to the second tank. So now the primary collection jug is sealed, so all the venting happens through the secondary jug. If it does overflow, this jug will catch the overflow without causing a new geyser. The next upgrade I did was I added a water level sensor to the primary collection tank or collection jug and to run an automatic shutoff circuit. Inside this little junction box, I have the power coming in and there's a little 12-volt power supply. That powers the level switch that I have on the collection jug, and the signal from that level switch turns on a solid state relay which powers both of the heaters. Now when the IPA reaches the top of the first tank, both the heaters get shut off. The chiller and the water pump keep running after the automatic shut off, so the cold loop will cool back down again. It works out really well since the cold loop is starting to get warm by the time the 1 gallon has been collected. The new shutoff circuit makes the whole thing very automatic. I feel a lot better about just letting it run until it shuts itself off. It takes a little less than an hour to get 1 gallon in the collection jug, and I know it takes another hour or so for the chiller to bring the temp back down. So I usually just fire it up and I come back in about 2 hours to collect the IPA and then restart the system if there's more IPA to distill. I found some nice glass 1 gallon jugs to replace my plastic jugs. So these guys just stay on the still cart now and they only get used for clean IPA. I did keep the secondary vent jug just as a backup, even though it doesn't really get wet anymore now that the automatic shutoff switch is working. Yeah, so I think that's it. I'm really happy with this setup now. I hope some of you out there can get some good info from this. Please feel free to comment in the comments if you have any suggestions, and thanks for watching.
Okay, so I did mess up, but I made you guys get to learn something. So this is what the alcohol is supposed to come out looking like. This is the one that's already been through the still before. You can see it looks like it's brand new, perfectly clear. This is what we're getting out today. A little bit of yellow gray color to it, and pretty sure I know what happened. What happens when you don't cure the IPA before you put it into the still? If the resin is still, dissolved into the IPA, then a lot more of it will evaporate out with the IPA. So anyway, this stuff's gonna have to be cured and run back through again. So yeah, my mistake, your learning experience. If you don't cure it before, this is what you get. Probably still work pretty well. Probably, really good for black parts and whatnot, but clear parts, it's probably going to come out foggy. But anyway, yeah.